This is a Dutch testing report tutorial to assist with the interpretation of the cortisol portion of the Dutch test. This video is for educational information only and is not to be used as any sort of medical advice. The results that we're actually showing on the screen are not results from any particular patient, just used to aid in the conversation. So as you look at the cortisol portion of the data, this is from page 5 of the report. There's a lot of data here. The data that we want to look most closely at, or at least initially, is the free cortisol pattern. So that gives us 4 different measurements of free cortisol. So we have a waking sample that shows us what the free cortisol is while sleeping. And then 2 hours later, there should be another collection where typically the value of cortisol is going to rise up quite a bit, and these values are very low in this particular patient. The values typically then come back down in the afternoon and then are at their lowest point at bedtime. So we're measuring those 4 individual samples, looking to see if we have that classic pattern of up and down throughout the day, and then we add the 4 up for this marker here. So this is a calculated marker of free cortisol throughout the day, and again, in this particular case, extremely low. And that is definitely atypical in terms of cortisol. So that tells us the free, active, circulating cortisol. Then the other value that we want to look closely at is the metabolized cortisol. The free cortisol is very important, but it's only about 1% of the total cortisol that's produced. So to look at the actual total cortisol production, that's what the metabolized cortisol is, the total glandular output of cortisol. And again, in this particular case, very, very low values. So when these values are extremely low, sometimes providers might want to take some additional steps to rule out something like Addison's disease that happens when the adrenal gland sees ACTH, which is a hormone from the brain, and then it makes cortisol. And in patients who have Addison's disease, they don't do that. And so there are some confirmatory tests for that. And that might be, in a case like this, something that a provider might want to rule out. Another thing that should be ruled out in a case like this is supplementation or taking medications that will suppress cortisol production. So classically, like prednisone, other glucocorticoids will or can shut down cortisol production. So if the patient's on that, it would be good. It would be good to know if there's any sort of glucocorticoid. So we look at the free cortisol pattern. When it's made by the adrenal glands, what we have is an interconversion with cortisone. And so because there's this back and forth throughout the body of cortisol and cortisone, it's a good confirmatory test to also look at the free cortisone pattern. So generally speaking, it follows about the same up and down pattern, and so it can be good to confirm what's going on with the cortisol by looking at the cortisone. So when the cortisol is extremely low in a case like this, we'd also want to look at the cortisone and see if that's telling about the same story in terms of that up and down pattern as it relates to cortisol. So there's this back and forth between cortisol and cortisone, and that's mediated by an enzyme called 11-beta HSD, and that's what's depicted here at the bottom. Is there's this back and forth between cortisol and cortisone, and then there's also cortisol and cortisone metabolism that push those hormones towards those end products for excretion, and that's an irreversible step. So once they go to one of those end products, then they're just ready for excretion. And the metabolism rate of cortisol and cortisone can be upregulated by things like obesity, excess thyroid. If you have a situation of long-term stress or glucocorticoid use, it can upregulate the metabolism of those. The metabolism can be lowered by things like having low thyroid function or liver function. And so that can be looked at in other cases where there are higher levels of either cortisol or cortisol metabolites. But again, in this particular case, all of those values are extremely low. So the minutia and the detail of all these results are not as interesting in a case like this where there's more of a profound lack of cortisol across the board, and that's something that's definitely worth looking at. The other reason that we look at cortisone is we want to know, in some cases, whether there is an extreme metabolic preference. With this 11 beta HSD that goes back and forth with the two enzyme types, is there a major preference for cortisol or a major preference for cortisone? And while the free cortisol and free cortisone patterns can give us some insight to that, the best marker for that is really to look at the total of the metabolites. So when we look at metabolized cortisol, we have a couple cortisol metabolites and a very highly concentrated, typically, cortisone metabolite. And so we want to look at the balance of those, and that's exactly what this index does, is it looks at the balance of all of those metabolites. So if it favors cortisol, then it's a picture more of somebody really hanging on to that cortisol and not readily deactivating it. On the other hand, if it points in the other direction, then that's a picture of cortisol that's fairly readily deactivated. But again, in a case like this where everything's so low across the board, that's probably the primary focus, and whether there's a slight preference one way or the other when the total is so low across the board is probably of marginal significance. So I hope that's been helpful. If you have more questions, do see our other educational videos at DutchTest.com, and if patients have particular questions about their results, please do send those to your healthcare provider and discuss those with your healthcare provider, and we thank you for testing with us.